Hello, my name is Joy Bennett and I'm the curator and archivist of the Hancock Historical Museum. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Prohibition era and how it affected Hancock County. In 1919, the 18th Amendment, known as Prohibition, banned the manufacture, transportation, and sale of intoxicating liquors. It was the result of a widespread temperance movement spearheaded mostly by women, with groups such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union, known as the WCTU, and the Anti-Saloon League, both of which were founded in Ohio. Even before this, in 1917, President Woodrow Wilson had declared a temporary wartime prohibition to save grain for producing food. After the end of World War I, the anti-German sentiments encouraged people to turn against the German immigrant-dominated industry of brewing beer. Both federal and local governments struggled to enforce prohibition, and enforcement was initially assigned to the Internal Revenue Service, or the IRS, and later it was transferred to the Justice Department. Ohio had its own solution to enforcement. In 1921, Ohio passed the Crab Act, which compensated mayors, judges, and other law enforcement officials with extra money whenever they arrested, convicted, and fined violators of the 18th Amendment. In March of 1927, the Supreme Court overturned this law, declaring it unconstitutional. There were several entries in the court records during my research throughout Hancock County that referenced a violation of the Crab Act. So it looks like J.H. Crawford got some money for this conviction. By 1830, the average American over 15 years old consumed nearly 7 gallons of pure alcohol a year, which is about 3 times as much as we drink today. And alcohol abuse, primarily by men, was destroying the lives of many, especially at a time when women had few legal rights and were utterly dependent on their husbands or other men for sustenance and support. The country's first serious anti-alcohol movement grew out of a fervor for reform that swept the nation from the 1830s and 1840s. Many abolitionists fighting to rid the country of slavery came to see drink as an equally great evil to be removed. The temperance movement, rooted in Americans' Protestant churches, first urged moderation, then encouraged drinkers to help each other resist temptation, and ultimately demanded that local, state, and national governments prohibit alcohol outright. After the Civil War, as millions of European immigrants, mostly from Ireland, Germany, and Italy, crowded into the nation's growing cities, they worked hard to integrate while retaining customs from their homelands. The brewing businesses boomed as German-American entrepreneurs scaled up production to provide the new immigrants with millions of gallons of beer. In the 1870s, inspired by the rising indignation of Methodist and Baptist clergymen, and by distraught wives and mothers whose lives had been ruined by the excesses of saloon going, thousands of women began to protest and organize politically for the cause of temperance. Their organization, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, became a force to be reckoned with, their cause enhanced by an alliance with Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and other women who were battling for women's suffrage and the right to vote. By the late 19th century, the WCTU, led by Frances Willard, could claim some significant successes. It had lobbied for local laws restricting alcohol and created an anti-alcohol educational campaign that reached into nearly every schoolroom in the nation. Its members viewed alcohol as the underlying source of a long list of social evils. The WCTU's ultimate goal, a prohibition amendment to the Constitution, still seemed impossibly out of reach. It would take a new organization, the Anti-Saloon League, for this dream to enter the realm of possibilities. Sarah Ann Baldwin was born in West Virginia on May 26, 1819, to Joshua and Eleanor Chenoweth Baldwin. They arrived in Findlay when Sarah was a teenager in 1835. Sarah became a school teacher before her marriage to lawyer Arnold Merriam. They had 3 children before Arnold's death of tuberculosis in 1844. In 1851, Sarah and Judge Robert L. Strother eloped. They had 3 daughters. They moved to Findlay from the country in 1875, and later that year, Judge Strother died. Sarah took up the cause of temperance at age 18 after witnessing her father's struggles with alcohol. She was a charter member of the Daughters of Temperance. Meetings were held at her home at 207 East Sandusky Street in Findlay, and she helped to organize the Hancock County Temperance Alliance in 1872. This group organized temperance crusades, marching 200 strong from the First Methodist Church. In 1873, Sarah Strother organized the WCTU in Hancock County and encouraged members to pray and sing in front of saloons. The state group organized in Springfield, and Sarah was sent as a delegate. She held all major offices in the WCTU and was called the Mother of the Movement in Hancock County. She continued attending national conventions, including giving a speech at Niagara Falls at the age of 80. She only stopped when she was in her mid-80s and her health prevented her. She died on April 17, 1900, just 3 weeks before her 90th birthday. Alice Elder was born in July of 1852 and was the eldest of 6 children. She lived and attended school in Delaware Township. She married Joseph Trimble Bell on October 22, 1874. Joseph was a farmer near Mount Blanchard, but they moved to Findlay between 1914 and 1918, when they lived at 806 Wilson Street. They had 5 children: Ora, Gail, John, Walter, and Fred. Alice founded the Alice I. Bell Women's Christian Temperance Union in Findlay. She was a crusader in WCTU work in the country for many years. The Bells left Findlay in 1921, moving to California. Alice died April 16, 1928, in California. Now we get to the more interesting national stuff with Carrie Nation. She was born as Carrie Amelia Moore in November of 1846, and she was a well-known proponent for Prohibition. She stood out from the thousands of WCTU members across the United States because she took a much more direct approach to encouraging prohibition of intoxicating liquor. She was born in Kentucky, where she grew up in a slaveholding family who owned a large farm. When she was 21, after the Civil War, her family had moved to Missouri, where she married Charles Gloyd. He was a young doctor who served in the Union Army, but he was also an alcoholic who couldn't hold down a job or support her. After she became pregnant, she went back to her parents. Her daughter, Charlene, was born in September, and Gloyd died just a few months later. In 1877, Carrie married David Nation, a preacher, attorney, and editor 19 years her senior. They moved to Texas and then later on to Medicine Lodge, Kansas. In 1889, where David became a pastor of the Christian church, Carrie was growing more religious and organized a local chapter of the WCTU. The WCTU, founded in 1874, had the goal of banning alcohol because of the suffering it caused to families. At a time when women lacked legal rights and had to depend on male breadwinners for some or all of the family income, an alcoholic and potentially violent spouse was a big deal. But the anti-alcohol crusade quickly came to also encompass other perceived sources of social impurity, such as smoking and sexual promiscuity. The union proposed to cure these vices through empowering women to vote and through the social ministrations of middle-class white women. Her more direct approach to the Prohibition crusade was often of interest to people. In 1900, Carrie Nation used a hatchet to smash up the bar at the Carrie Hotel in Wichita, Kansas, and was arrested. She responded with alacrity to appeals from citizens of other towns to close their saloons. She entered states where liquor sales were legal, and her behavior provoked a tremendous uproar and sent her to jail repeatedly for disorderly conduct and disturbing the peace. Later, fines were paid by the sale of pewter hatchet pins. Nation wielded her voice as effectively as she wielded her hatchet, eloquently speaking her mind and inspiring others on numerous occasions. Even sworn enemies acknowledged her success with compelling enforcement of prohibition laws and spreading her message. The Nations were divorced in 1901, and David died in 1903. Carrie completed her last speaking tour in 1910 owing to failing health. She then purchased property in Eureka Springs, Arkansas. This included a farm with a building that she dubbed Hatchet Hall, which she intended to become a school of prohibition. She crumpled on the stage in January of 1911 during what was to be her final oration. In June, Carrie Nation died, isolated and dirt poor in Leavenworth, Kansas. Her remains were buried in Belton. Prohibition would become nationwide 8 years later with the ratification of the 18th Amendment. In her fight for temperance, Nation had contributed significantly to its outcome, but unfortunately was not able to see it. The Anti-Saloon League was founded in 1893 in Oberlin, Ohio. Its first offices were in Columbus, Ohio, but in 1909, the League moved to nearby Westerville, Ohio, where it also operated the American Issue Publishing Company. After 1895, the League became a powerful national organization. The League was a nonpartisan organization that focused on the single issue of prohibition. The League had branches across the United States to work with churches and organizing resources for the prohibition fight. In 1913, the League announced its campaign to attain national prohibition through a constitutional amendment. Allied with other temperance forces, especially the WCTU, the League oversaw the election of 2/3 majorities necessary in both houses of Congress to initiate what became the 18th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. During this time, immediately before Prohibition, the brewing industry was the most prosperous of the beverage alcohol industries. Because of the competitive nature of brewing, the brewers entered the retail business. Americans called retail businesses selling beer and whiskey by the glass saloons. To expand the sale of beer, brewers expanded the number of saloons. Therefore, lots of saloons. It was not uncommon to find one saloon for every 150 or 200 Americans, including those who did not drink. Hard-pressed to earn profits, saloon keepers sometimes introduced vices such as gambling and prostitution into their establishments in an attempt to earn profits. Many Americans considered saloons offensive, noxious institutions. It's really hard. Not everyone favored prohibition, though. In 1912, a petition was sent around the area and many men signed it. This booklet is over 20 pages long and was filled with Hancock County names that wanted Hancock County to stay wet. Prohibition supporters expected the dry era to bring prosperity. They expected sales of clothing and household goods to go through the ceiling, for rents and property values to rise as saloons closed and neighborhoods improved. Chewing gum, juice, and soft drink companies all expected growth. Theater producers expected new crowds as Americans looked for new ways to entertain themselves without alcohol. Sadly, none of this came to pass. The initial economic effects of Prohibition were largely negative. Restaurants failed, theater profits declined, and a few of the other economic benefits that had been predicted came to pass. Closing breweries, distilleries, and saloons led to the elimination of thousands of jobs, and in turn, thousands more jobs were eliminated for barrel makers, truckers, waiters, and other related trades, therefore not causing any improvement to the economy. Now, as far as local businesses, Krantz Brewery had survived through the First World War with Hancock County going dry. For a while before the war, they made beer that wasn't beer. Essentially, it was beer, but without the alcohol. When Prohibition went into effect in 1919, Krantz changed its name to Krantz Products Company and began manufacturing non-alcoholic beverages such as ginger ale and root beer. Many restaurants and bars were in financial trouble during Prohibition and were forced to close or change what sort of business they had. The restaurants stopped offering alcohol, but some of the bars became florists, bookshops, and other places of business. Some were quite crafty, and behind these legitimate business fronts of restaurants and florists, they had speakeasies in the back. One of the speakeasies we know of in Findlay was the Mecca. The Mecca was located at 224 South Main Street, currently the parking lot of Huntington Bank. The building was built in 1874, and a series of saloons and restaurants were housed in this building. The Mecca opened in February of 1919. Leif and Mary Arnold purchased the building from the Kubler Brewing Company. The Mecca was in business for over 70 years in the same location. Unfortunately, the building was damaged by fire in 1975 and had to be razed. The manager of the Mecca, Marion Burkett, was arrested in 1921 in a sting operation and released on $300 bond for selling intoxicating liquor. Another suspected Findlay speakeasy was Haley's Bar, located at 407 South Main Street, which is now the Bistro on Main. Unfortunately, everything I can find shows that Haley's Bar didn't exactly open until much later. So it's hard to say, because if they had opened in the late 1930s, that would have been post-Prohibition. However, the Brunswick was a pool hall that advertised pool, billiards, cigars, and soft drinks. We suspect those drinks were a bit harder than a Pepsi. It was located in the basement of 401 South Main Street from 1911 through 1971. One of the legal exceptions to the Prohibition law was that pharmacists were allowed to dispense whiskey by prescription for any number of ailments, ranging from anxiety to influenza. Bootleggers quickly discovered that running a pharmacy was a perfect front for their trade. As a result, the number of registered pharmacists in New York State tripled during the Prohibition era. For those that didn't have a handy doctor to write a prescription for alcohol or didn't really want to visit the speakeasies, they had other options. You could make the liquor yourself in a still, or you could purchase from the gangs that were transporting rum, beer, and other liquors up and down the Dixie Highway. Not pictured. Those are the cops. The fines for transporting liquor started at $5 and gradually went up the longer Prohibition was in effect. You can see that in 1931, the fine was up to $300, not a small amount today, let alone in 1931 during the Depression. The fines for making alcohol also went up as Prohibition went on. In 1921, the fine was $150, in addition to losing the product and the still. The trade in unregulated alcohol had serious consequences for public health. As the trade in illegal alcohol became more lucrative, the quality of alcohol on the black market declined. On average, 1,000 Americans died every year during the Prohibition from the effects of drinking tainted liquor. And here's a fun little infographic that we made showing, calculated by the arrest records, the amount of alcohol seized in gallons. Predominantly, it was moonshine, corn liquor, white mule. All of those are the same thing, essentially. Then it was beer, whiskey, wine, and then other alcohol, including gin, rum, and when it just said alcohol. Another infographic. Approximate figures here are based off of entries in the mayor's court, police arrests, and civic criminal court records available to the Hancock Historical Museum, showing how many people were arrested for possession, intoxication, transporting, selling, and manufacturing illegal liquor. between 1919 and 1933. So, here's going to be some interesting facts coming up. Did you know that Congress had its very own bootlegger? Members of Congress who wanted alcohol during Prohibition could turn to Capitol Hill's top bootlegger, George L. Cassaday. Cassaday walked through the halls of Congress, making up to 25 deliveries of illegal booze a day, while Capitol Police allowed him in at all hours. Over 5 years, he supplied bottles of whiskey, moonshine, scotch, bourbon, and gin from a sturdy leather briefcase. His politician friends got him a room to work out of in the House office building. In 1925, when he was arrested while ferreting 6 quarts of whiskey to a House member, he had on a light green hat, and from the press accounts, the man in the green hat stuck. Cassaday pleaded guilty and simply switched to selling in the Senate office building. His infamy spread to the office of the Vice President, Charles Curtis, who set up a sting operation in 1930 with a Prohibition agent, Dry Spy, watching Cassaday from the Senate stationery store. Cassaday was arrested with 6 bottles of gin and his client list, which was never published. He was sentenced to a year in prison. He later wrote that he helped 80% of Congress violate Prohibition laws. The term speakeasy did not originate in Prohibition. It came from the 2-word phrase speak easy, coined by American journalist Samuel Hudson back in 1889. Hudson, in his 1909 book Pennsylvania and Its Public Men, recalled that while in Pittsburgh in 1889, a new city liquor licensing law reduced the numbers of taverns there to only 96. That encouraged a rise in illegal bars all over town. Hudson asked Tim O'Leary, a local Democratic Party politician, to show him one. O'Leary explained that an elderly Irish widow who sold illegal beer and whiskey once warned her patrons in her brogue to "Spake easy now, the police are at the door." So Hudson said, "Spake easy" became the moniker for the hundreds of unlicensed taverns in Pittsburgh. When Hudson returned home to Philadelphia, he wrote a column about the speakeasy in the daily newspaper, The Item. "It is I who brought to Philadelphia and popularized the term speakeasy as it applied to illicit liquor joints," Hudson boasted in his book, published 11 years before Prohibition. The term had an instantaneous success, being taken up by the people and police, and has been in universal use ever since. Speakeasies often had green doors. During Prohibition, chances were that a door painted green meant at front of a speakeasy. In Chicago, that tradition lives on, with 2 of the town's well-known bars dating from the 1920s. The Green Door Tavern on North Orleans Street is an Irish pub that opened in 1921 as a bar called the Drifter. It was also a former Prohibition speakeasy that's tucked away in the Green Door's basement. On North Broadway, the famed Green Mill Cocktail Lounge was once a speakeasy, part owned by Machine Gun Jack McGurn of Al Capone's outfit. Capone, also a partner in the Green Mill, used to sit in a booth that is still inside the lounge. When comedian Joey Lewis refused to perform at the Green Mill in 1927, McGurn sent over 3 men who cut Lewis's throat and face. He survived, and Capone paid for his medical work. But McGurn was initially charged in the 1929 St. Valentine's Day Massacre, but he beat the rap due to a lack of evidence. There were a lot of other unintended consequences of Prohibition. It didn't just make alcohol illegal. There were other things. When something people want is made illegal, a black market opens up, and this makes way for gangs and mobsters. And other things. One group of newly public drinkers during Prohibition was women. Women had never been as temperate as the WCTU's activism had made them all appear. Women's new willingness to drink in public, or at least the semi-public atmosphere of the speakeasy, owed much to Prohibition's achievement, the death of the saloon, whose masculine culture no longer governed norms of public drinking. Public drinking by women and college youth and wet attitudes disseminated by cultural media pushed along a process that social scientists call the normalization of drinking. That is, the breakdown of cultural prescriptions against liquor. Normalization, part of the long history of decay in Victorian social mores, began before the Prohibition era and did not fully bear fruit until long afterward, but the process gained impotence both from the achievements and failures of national prohibition. Bootleggers during Prohibition used souped-up automobiles to stay ahead of federal agents and local police while transporting illegal whiskey on the back roads in the dark of night. Take a car that looked ordinary on the outside, modify the engine for greater speed, remove the floorboards, passenger and back seats to store as many cases of liquor as possible, install extra suspension springs to handle the weight, a dirt-protecting plate in front of the radiator, and run the prohibited booze to customers by outsmarting or outrunning the authorities. To elude federal prohibition agents, sheriffs, and cops on the road, these daring runners needed sharp driving skills to speed and maneuver along dirt, gravel, single lane, and occasionally paved roads after dark, and at times with their headlights turned off. Even before Prohibition came to an end in 1933, racing these high-performance cars became a popular pastime among the runners in North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, Georgia, and other places in the South. They raced each other's cars, many of them Ford models, on weekends and afternoons out in the country on makeshift dirt tracks. Such were the bootlegger roots of the stock car and what would evolve into the National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing, or NASCAR, in 1947. Booze runners looked for good mechanics who knew how to make their engines run faster and handle better than police vehicles. This became even more important in 1932 when Ford introduced its flathead V8 with 8 cylinders, a powerful car that runners started using. But then so did the police department to keep pace. By the nature of their illegal liquor business, veering fast among curvy, mountainous roads, runners taught themselves to be the best stock car drivers of the era and beyond. Although national prohibition ended in 1933, production of illegal whiskey continued for years afterward to avoid taxes and regulations. Many future NASCAR drivers cut their teeth bootlegging illegal moonshine in the 1940s. The legacy of the Prohibition runner went beyond casual backwoods racing in 1936, when the city of Daytona, Florida, held the first organized stock car race as a promotion. It lost money, but a Prohibition-era mechanic was determined to find a way to organize stock car racing. It took him more than a decade, but NASCAR's organization set a single set of rules for racetracks and formalized the sport. The first NASCAR race was held in Daytona on February 15, 1948. Now we get into the gangs. The prohibition of alcohol led to an upswing in crime and the beginning of the gangster era. Finley's closest brush with gangs was with the Purple Gang out of Detroit, Michigan. Henry Ford demanded a sober workforce, so he backed the 1916 Damon Act. This forced bootleggers to bring in liquor from Toledo instead of Detroit. And judges often took a lenient view of offenders. The Damon Act was declared unconstitutional in 1919, but in the same year that Prohibition was passed. Canada became a major point for running alcohol, particularly in the port city of Windsor, Ontario, directly across the Detroit River from Detroit. The Canadian government had banned the use of alcoholic beverages, but still licensed distilleries and breweries to manufacture and export alcohol. The Purple Gang was Detroit's most notorious organized crime gang in the 1920s and 1930s. Led by the Bernstein family, most notably brothers Ray and Abe, the Purple Gang was made up of Jewish immigrants from Detroit's Lower East Side. There are a few theories as to the origin of the name Purple Gang. One explanation is that a member of the gang was a boxer who wore purple shorts during his bouts. Another explanation is that the name came from a conversation between two shopkeepers. These boys are not like other children of their age. They're tainted, off color. Yes, replied the other shopkeeper. They're rotten, purple like the color of bad meat. They're a purple gang. The gang began by hijacking alcohol smuggled by others across the Canadian border during Prohibition. Al Capone, the notorious Chicago gangster, chose to use the Purple Gang to supply whiskey rather than battle them for Detroit territory. For several years, the gang managed the flourishing business of supplying Canadian whiskey to the Capone organization in Chicago. Detroit was said to have 15,000 speakeasies run by the Purple Gang. In the 1920s, the Purple Gang was involved in the Cleaners and Dyers War, a dispute between the cleaning industry and its union. The union hired the Purple Gang to keep its members in line and harass non-members. In 1928, several members of the Purple Gang were tried for extortion for their role in the war, but all were acquitted. Around the time of the trial, the Purple Gang was in its heyday. They controlled all of Detroit's underworld, including the city's gambling, liquor, and drug trade. The Purple Gang of the late 1920s was nearly invincible to law enforcement, since witnesses were too terrified to testify in murder and criminal trials. The Purple Gang began to dissolve in the early 1930s through inter-gang strife and warfare. In September of 1931, the Purple Gang murdered 3 of their own members. The 3 men, Jaime Paul, Joe Sutker, and Joe Leibowitz, were lured to a peace negotiation at the Collingwood Manor apartment building in Detroit, where they were shot. Saul Levine, the man who drove them to the meeting, was later caught and pressured into testifying against the gang. As a result, 3 out of 4 of the men involved with the murders, including Ray Bernstein, were convicted of third-degree murder and sent to jail for life sentences. The whole episode became known as the Collingwood Manor Massacre and marked the downfall of the Purple Gang. According to Detroit Police Chief of Detectives James E. McCarty, the convictions in the Collingwood Massacre broke the back of the once powerful Purple Gang, causing an end to more than 5 years of arrogance and terrorism. Now, John Dillinger. There was more to Prohibition era than bootleggers running booze out of Chicago and Detroit. There was also the Depression era bank-robbing gangsters like John Dillinger. The Dillinger Gang was famous for a successful string of bank robberies in the Midwestern United States between September of 1933 and July of 1934. The gang killed 10 men and wounded 7 more while committing these crimes. They had 3 escapes from jail that resulted in the death of a sheriff and the wounding of 2 guards. John Dillinger did time in the Indiana State Reformatory for armed robbery. There he met Harry Pierpont and other men who would join him in his infamous crime spree. After serving 9 years, Dillinger was granted parole upon the death of his stepmother and proceeded to arrange to break out some of his friends from jail and stage some bank heists. In less than 4 months in 1933, they robbed 6 banks, including the Bluffton Bank, and made away with over $59,000. By June of 1934, their total haul had reached over $330,000. This included a heist at the First National Bank in Fostoria. Dillinger decided to visit a girl he'd met in Dayton, Ohio in September of 1933, but was followed, arrested, and taken to the Allen County Jail in Lima, Ohio. In the meantime, Dillinger's friend Harry Pierpont and his men escaped from the Indiana State Reformatory and made their way to a hideout in Hamilton, Ohio. Dillinger was imprisoned under the care of Sheriff Jess Sarber. Pierpont and 2 other armed men approached the jailhouse just as Sheriff Sarber and his wife were finishing dinner. Pierpont knocked on the door and announced that they were officials from the state penitentiary and needed to see Dillinger. When Sarber reached for his weapon, Pierpont panicked and shot him, later clubbing the downed officer as well. Mrs. Sarber then gave the men the jail keys, and they sprang Dillinger. Sarber died a few hours later, making all members of the gang accessories to murder. Once Dillinger was free, the gang headed to Chicago to put together one of the most organized and deadly bank robber gangs in the country. Pierpont and Dillinger knew they needed heavy firepower, ammunition, and bulletproof vests, which they stole from the police arsenal in Peru, Indiana. On October 17, 1933, a posse of Findlay and Hancock County law officers were patrolling the Lincoln Highway on the lookout for Harry Pierpont and John Dillinger. They planned a trap for Dillinger and Pierpont at the Macomb Bank on October 24th of 1933, but sadly they never showed. On December 16th of 1933, there was a report that Dillinger had been seen in a Findlay barber shop. D.H. Dyer identified Dillinger as the man who came in for a haircut at the Wilson Barber Shop on East Crawford Street. He arrived at 2:30 p.m. wearing a shirt, coat, and trousers stained with blood. The man kept his head down and seemed in a hurry to leave. After a long and bloody career, Dillinger was finally stopped on July 22, 1934. He was seen going into the Biograph Theater in Chicago to see the crime drama Manhattan Melodrama, starring Clark Gable, Myrna Loy, and William Powell. When the film ended, Melvin Purvis of the FBI had a sting set up. Dillinger attempted to draw a gun and ran down an alley. 3 agents followed, and multiple shots were fired. Dillinger was hit from behind and fell face first to the ground. He died immediately. During Prohibition, the consumption of hard liquor probably dropped as much as 50%, and other alcoholic beverages by about a third. As a result, it did have some positive effects. The number of deaths due to cirrhosis of the liver fell considerably, but that was offset to some extreme by deaths caused by drinking unadulterated alcohol. However, in 1929, Mabel Walker Wildebrandt, the former Assistant U.S. Attorney General who headed Prohibition prosecutions, conceded that alcohol could be purchased at almost any hour of the day or night, either in rural districts, smaller towns, or cities. At the same time, Prohibition almost completely destroyed the brewing industry, causing a huge loss in jobs. It also resulted in $11 billion in tax revenues, cost $300 million to enforce. The onset of the Great Depression following the Wall Street crash in 1929 further weakened the case for Prohibition, as newly elected President FDR said in 1932, "What America needs now is a drink." So, on March 22, 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt signed into law the Cullen-Harrison Act, legalizing beer and wine with low alcohol content, 3.2% by weight for beer, or near beer. In December of 1933, ratification of the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment. The negative economic consequences of Prohibition fast-tracked the move to repeal the law. Even farmers who fought for Prohibition now fought for the repeal because of the negative effects it had on the agriculture business. Prior to 1920, about 14% of federal, state, and local tax revenues came from the alcohol industry. In 1929, when the Great Depression hit and tax revenues plunged, the government made millions by taxing beer. And so,